Thanks for tuning in. Today's conversation is with my client, Brad Johnson, who is the VP of Advisors Development at Advisors Excel. Brad joined the company as the 12th employee back in 2007 when it was still completely unheard of. Today, Advisors Excel employs over 530 people and is the largest independent insurance brokerage firm in the US. In his role at Advisors Excel, Brad's job is to teach good advisors how to become great business owners. He mentors a small group of the country's most elite financial advisors, and through his mentorship, this group was responsible for capturing over $1 billion of new assets last year alone. Brad's 12 years of success teaching financial advisors how to become world-class eventually led him to launching the Elite Advisor Blueprint podcast, which we're going to talk all about today. In addition to crushing professionally, Brad's even bigger accomplishments are being married to his high school sweetheart, Sarah, and being a proud father to 3 amazing kids, Braun, Nash, and Nellie. Brad, welcome, man, and thank you very much for being here.
Glad to be here, Charlie. It's an honor.
So, Brad, what I want to do is I want to start off, I would love for you to start by actually just simply explaining what your podcast is, what it's about, and who it serves.
Yeah, so I definitely got into podcasting by accident. It really started in a mastermind group that I was in a number of years back with a guy named Michael Hyatt, who also has a pretty successful podcast of his own. And really the struggle that I had that a podcast solved was in financial services. When you're dealing with super successful financial advisors, kind of like a doctor, they have a very busy schedule. They're in and out of appointments all day long. And I was really trying to do a form of a mastermind, kind of a virtual mastermind call once a month that they could log in on a platform like Zoom, like we're on today, and just learn from interesting people and get, kind of an eclectic mix of outside business leaders, thought leaders, authors, and just distill some ideas from them that then serve the financial services community, which was great, other than the fact that just people had a tough time getting on at a set scheduled time once a month. So in this conversation with Michael Hyatt, where I was kind of explaining my problem, he said, well, why don't you just make that conversation a podcast, and then they can just consume that content on demand, right? Think of it like Netflix, just log in and binge watch or binge listen whenever time suits them, walking the dog, on the treadmill, whatever kind of their daily routine is. So that's how the podcast came to be originally.
And it's the Elite Advisor Blueprint podcast. Who does it serve?
So it's, when I first put it out, it was for financial advisors, which actually this was another lesson that I learned early on when it came to podcasting. At the time, I started the podcast in 2016. Even in the last 3 to 4 years, I've seen an explosion of podcasts. It wasn't like mine was the first one out there. But one of the pieces of advice from Michael Hyatt was, make sure you are niching down to your ideal listener. And for me, it naturally served the independent financial advisor because that's the space that I coach in and mentor in and all of my clients are in. And so the Elite Advisor Blueprint was specifically for the independent financial advisor out there. And what I found, what was interesting in this mastermind group that I was in, there were 12, 14 other guys from different industries and different backgrounds. And one of the guys in the group was in IT security. And he listened to the first couple episodes and he's like, dude, that was a really good show, which of course makes you feel good, if it's your show.
Sure. Yeah.
And he's like, why are you making your scope so narrow where it's just financial advisors? Why don't you make this for entrepreneurs? And Michael's advice to me, which was gold and has served me really well, is like, no, absolutely do not do that. Niche down to your ideal listener, because your ideal listener, your ideal client's going to know when they stumble across in your first 15 seconds of your intro to each show says, hey, this is for independent financial advisors out there. They're going to know this is for me and listen in. And what I found is there have been a number of people since then from a number of different industries. They still listen to the show. It's not like they can't still listen to the show if the content's good, but it attracts your ideal client. So that's who mine serves. And that was advice I was given early on, because I think a lot of podcasts struggle to really define their ideal client. And because I know now my show is just for independent financial advisors, it also makes me a better host, because I will ask, a good example, I had a guy named Dylan Proctor on, who's one of the foremost wine authorities in the world. And I love wine. I collect wine. And I wanted to nerd out and go completely down a rabbit hole of just my own self-interest. But I made sure, because I know my show is for independent advisors, I asked, what sort of wine tasting events could financial advisors have to get referrals from clients and that type of thing. And so by knowing who your show is for, it will also make sure you're asking questions, if you're doing an interview style format, that serve your audience, and making sure you kind of stay down that path of leading the interview, I guess, being a good steward of the interview for your audience.
That's perfect. Actually, I was going to ask you a bit more about that. And it's the way you worded it, it was perfect. I take a lot of calls with first-time podcasters and new clients. And when they're about to launch, many of them struggle with defining that audience. They struggle with defining that perfect listener. They want to try to be really broad. They want to try to hit the masses. But the problem is when you try to be everything to everyone, you're pretty much nothing to nobody. So I couldn't agree more with what you're saying there. So with your podcast, Brad, what was when you launched it, what was the overall goal that you had? What did you want to achieve with it?
That's a good question. I think when I first launched it, I didn't really know.
Okay.
And that's not the right answer, by the way, for those listening in. I guess the main thing that I wanted to accomplish with it is I wanted to take the 100 officers or so that we coach across the country, and I wanted to take good, thoughtful conversations with people that I admire and I can learn from. And I wanted to hand deliver that to them in their pocket via their iPhone or their Android, where they could consume and listen to that content at their ease. So it was actually a much smaller goal than what the thing has turned into.
Mm-hmm.
But that was my first goal, was I just want to bring value to my existing clients at kind of a virtual mastermind type of conversation. And since then, it's done a lot more than that, but that was the original goal.
Oh, that's actually, I think it's a good goal, because a lot of people are thinking, they kind of, their first initial thought is, well, how is this going to make me money? But your thought was, how can I bring value to my current clients and the people that I serve? So I think that's actually a pretty healthy way to go about it, as opposed to the flip side. And then, naturally, if things go well, the other stuff comes in later.
Yeah, that's one thing that I was fortunate. I know some people, they are trying to podcast to drive revenue and pretty quickly to fund it, right? I was fortunate that podcasting is not my main gig. It's kind of a side gig that has become a really cool way to serve my audience and also to grow my own personal business. And so I never had the pressure of trying to, throw a bunch of ads in, and just, it was always, how can I have an amazing conversation with someone that can bring a ton of value to the independent financial advisor community out there? And so I had no pressure. The first 2 years, I didn't really even tell people how to work with me, which was, in hindsight, not very smart. But once I built an audience and a community where they just saw value, it's kind of the Gary Vaynerchuk, jab, 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 right hook, just provide a lot of value. But then when I started working in little, minute and a half, 2-minute ads where I say, hey, we've got a future event coming up. Here's how to apply. If you'd like to see if it's a fit for you to attend. Because I'd built that audience up, I'd get 10, 15 applications that would come in. And had I started maybe the other way, where I'd push that up front, that probably wouldn't have been the case.
Yeah. Far too many people I find are, a lot of the people that I'm working with, they already have products and services. And so the podcast is really an extension of their business. It's a piece of the marketing mix. Mm-hmm. But I talk to a lot of people that don't have products and services yet, and they try to start the way that you were talking about before, where it's, you basically, a podcast takes a lot of time to build. It's not going to be an overnight success. And so if you have to make money right away, you're going to compromise the integrity of the show, as far as I'm concerned. So I think it's much better to do it while you're not shackled to having to make money or to hit certain download numbers. You're just there to provide value to your current audience or the people that you're already serving, that sort of thing. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with Jordan Harbinger, who runs one of the largest podcasts in the world. And his stance is most people shouldn't do podcasts. And
yeah,
it kind of goes to that. Like, they think they're going to be the next Kardashian that's, some celebrity via podcast. And he even shared with me, he's like, the best way to monetize a podcast has nothing to, so you're not Tim Ferriss with millions of downloads where you're going to have companies pay you for ad spends. He's like, the best way to monetize a podcast is have a great product already that's somehow related to your company, your brand, whatever that is, and then build a great show and then say, hey, oh, by the way, if you like the show, here's a special offer on this product for you, our listeners, right? And to actually be able to monetize more of your product or your book or whatever it is that you offer. But where I think a lot of people do it in reverse, they try to monetize a podcast before they have a great product or an offering or an event for their audience.
If that's the best piece of advice that this conversation provides, I will be extremely happy. That's one thing that I hear over and over and over again. So I think people hearing that from someone who's actively doing it, who's had some success, I think that is really, really good advice. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of people out there who don't have a big audience. They don't have a big social following, and they have this fear that if they start a podcast, no one's ever going to listen. On the flip side, I've actually heard you say that if nobody listened to your podcast, it would still be worth it. And I think to help illustrate why you felt that way, you actually have this story of Ron Carson, who is one of the most successful financial advisors in the US. And he used interviews to build this network before podcasting even existed. Do you think that you could share that story? I think there's I think there's a big lesson there for anybody who's worried about the initial size of their audience.
Yeah, so I'll hit that in two parts. I'll definitely tell the Ron Carson story, but the reason I've said I would do the podcast, whether or not anybody listened or not, has a lot to do with the format of my show. So I do an interview style where I'll have different authors. Ron Carson was one of my early guests. For those not familiar, Carson Wealth manages 10 billion plus of assets. So one of the most successful RIAs in the United States. And I look at it as what a podcast creates is if you just imagine a virtual stage, and that virtual stage is your stage, you own it, you're the host. And the cool thing is if you invite people to have a great conversation on that stage, you will be surprised how many people say yes. It's no different than Charlie, when you asked me, okay, I'd love to interview you. I'm like, oh, that's an honor. To me, my own personal ego, I'm like, wow, Charlie values me enough. He thinks I can have a great conversation that will bring value to others. And of course, we're friends. So I accepted, not even knowing what we were going to talk about. But be more prepared than that if you're doing a show. But I've been very, very surprised. I think I've been turned down less than 5 times.
Yep.
Now I haven't asked Peyton Manning on or Tom Brady yet, but you get turned down a lot less than you think. And I think one of the key things, this is another piece of advice, if you're starting a podcast, and it's an interview style, make sure you start with the first early episodes to be like your premium, very best guest, because that sets the standard for the rest of your guests. Because what they're going to do when you invite them on, they're going to go look at your previous episodes. They're going to say, is this podcast relevant to anyone? And if you've got a couple well-known guests on there, that basically sells the podcast like, oh, this is a legit podcast. So that would be a little tip. I had the benefit, I had Michael Hyatt as a personal friend that I was in a mastermind with. So he was actually interview number 1. I invited Ron Carson to that interview to listen in, because at the time I did them live on Zoom. And Ron's like, hey, I just released a book. Would you interview me? And I said, absolutely. Let's make you your own episode. So he was episode 2. Right. So that right there speaks to the power of just having this virtual stage of a podcast. You'll be surprised who shows up. So to that story on Ron Carson in the podcast interview with him. So he, when he was back being an independent financial advisor, back when he was actually seeing clients. So that was before the days of really the internet. So he had this thing, he called it Habits of Top Achievers. And it was kind of a podcast where he would sit down. He's based out of Omaha, Nebraska. So he would actually interview some of the most successful entrepreneurs in his marketplace and have to sit down in a recording studio. And then they would press that interview on a CD. And then he would mail those CDs out to his clients. And Ron's purpose for doing it was he knew that if I'm going to interview a multimillionaire, a billionaire, number one, that's an ideal prospect for me as a financial advisor, but they're probably not going to respond to any other marketing funnel that I might have. So in our industry, it's typically public events, like live speaking engagements or dinner seminars. Might be that you do a radio show, TV show would be kind of the upper echelon. A multimillionaire, billionaire is probably not going to respond to any of those marketing funnels. But what they will respond to is, hey, I'd love to sit down and interview you for an hour. You've been ultra successful. I'd love to pick your brain and share with my audience some of your habits that have led you to be a top achiever, and it would just be an honor. Most people, personally, their own ego, they're gonna be like, okay, cool, I'm in, right?
Yeah.
And so the secret that I got from Ron, which actually is carried through on my podcast, and I've seen it play out over and over, is the reason I would do a podcast, whether or not anyone was listening, is my circle, my connections. Cameron Herold, who also came on the show, he has a saying, your network is your net worth. And besides just the monetary, I like connecting with great, amazing people. You know, it doesn't matter how much they make or them being able to increase my net worth. It has to do with like great connections to make me a better dad, a better husband, and just share some knowledge. And that to me is the power of the podcast as well, because my personal circle of one-to-one connections, I now have multiple New York Times bestselling authors on my cell phone. I have, you know, basically some of the largest asset managers in the country because we all connected via a podcast, via a fun conversation. And then what's also happened is you'll be surprised how small that circle is once you have an amazing guest on. Well, they happen to be connected with other amazing guests. So they've made a lot of those intros just organically and say, hey, I know such and such, they should come on your show in the future. So that is why I would do a podcast, whether or not anyone's listening, is just because it's kind of the Jim Rohn saying of you're the average of the 5 people you surround yourself with. And I'm always trying to make sure my circle, I'm surrounding myself with the very best. And so that's, the podcast is definitely, I've created some lifelong friends off of guests that have come on the show.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of my clients say the exact same thing, Brad. And then going back to what you said about this fear that people have, you know, they often think, who's going to agree to do an interview with me? Who am I? You know, but if you reframe it to the way that you had suggested, where it's like, yeah, but to them, it's an honor. They want to be able to share their wisdom. You know, they have egos and they want to be able to share their wisdom with your audience. And I mean, it's just a different way of looking at it. So I think people need to kind of put that to the side, because like you said, people will be a lot more surprised than they think when they start seeing like who's accepting your interview requests. And like you said, you could just, you know, you have a couple of names that are well known in the industry or that you're serving, and that's usually enough. In an email, you can even link to it and say, hey, like, you know, here are some of the past interviews we've done. And I think that's amazing advice, because I think that's a big fear for a lot of people is no one's gonna accept this interview request.
Yeah, and another tip on that is just make sure, if you're doing an interview style podcast, make sure it's an absolute win for the person you're interviewing.
100%.
I think a lot of times people are like just very selfish and they just look at their own benefits to where, hey, I want to have such and such guest on because they're a big name and I know they're going to grow my listenership if I have them on. And it's all like, how can you help my podcast? What I try to do is flip that around. How can I serve the guests? So if they're an author, they have a new book coming out. Number one, we're going to talk about the book. We're going to dive in because that's free publicity for them. But then I'm going to buy like 25, 50 copies of their book and I'm going to give them away.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, hey, thanks for listening in. If you'd like a free copy of, you know, like James Clear, we just had him on and gave away a bunch of copies of his book. And so number one, you're helping your guests. Number two, your audience loves it because like, oh, wow, free value add, a free book. And so I always try to make sure it's a win for the guests, help them promote. It also helps serve the show because a lot of authors, a lot of thought leaders already have some gives, right? They've got a PDF downloadable tool. And if you make that as a gift to your audience, now you're also driving your email subscriptions and all of that. And it's a win for your guest. It's a win for your audience. It's a win for you. And if you can kind of have that trifecta on every show, then it will also help grow your listenership much more quickly.
Yeah, I think it can become pretty clear too when an interview is only done for shallow reasons. So if you are only doing it because you're like, this person has a huge audience and I want to leverage it, they're going to be able to see that. You know, I think there's things that you can do to make them feel super appreciated and super valued. I've heard lots of stories where people are, they have this interview with someone who's super successful. They took the time to come on the podcast and share their knowledge, and they don't even follow up with them to say like, thank you. They don't follow up with them to really even share the interview when it comes out. It's like, yeah. I think there's a lot you can do just in the preparation, in the pre-game, pre-interview, post-interview. You can even follow up 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, a year later and say, hey, I didn't forget about how you helped us. Is there anything that we can promote for you? Whether it's a blog post, an article, whether it's a new book, there's always something. So I think there's ways for you to go above and beyond. So it's not just like you're not just using them for their audience. So yeah.
And something to that point, one of the things that I always do, I'm trying to think if I've ever not done this. If I've not done it, I apologize to one of the guests that I've had on, but I will always send them a thank you gift with a note that says, hey, I appreciate this aspect of you coming on. And this is, I'm sure, one of the things my audience will value. And then kind of John Ruhlin-esque giftology, an actual real meaningful gift that's personalized to them. And it is amazing how many of my guests have responded back and been like, dude, first off, this has never, ever happened. And I've been on hundreds of podcasts at this point. And so.
And who do you think they're going to remember when all the interviews that they've done? They're going to remember you, who's kind of followed up with this like really nice gift that was really thoughtful, or are they going to remember the guy that just has interview after interview after interview and doesn't really, have that same treatment?
Yeah. One of our clients calls it putting a scratch in the record. And he's like, if you can do that in a good way, obviously not a bad way, but if you can show up differently, it also, what else? It just comes back 10 times. They're going to be much more likely to actually share your show when it goes live. If you've shown up way different, you've brought value to them, promoted something that's, valuable to them or their business. And it just, which I think, it all comes back and your show's going to grow that much faster because of it.
What is an example of a gift that you may have given a past person that you've interviewed?
So here was one that I probably got the best feedback on. So there is a guy, his name is also Brad. He calls himself Brad the Gift Maker.
Okay.
I was connected with him via John Ruhlin, who was introduced to me by Joey Coleman from having him on the podcast. So it just goes to show, speaking of exactly what we talked about earlier of your circle. So Joey Coleman, New York Times bestseller, introduced me to John Ruhlin, who wrote the book Giftology, has a really cool framework around giving gifts that are personalized and showing up differently. Well, so I'm talking with John and he's like, oh, I've got the guy for you. His name's Brad the Gift Maker. So he does these really cool mugs. And so they're handcrafted mugs. And what he does is he basically asks questions about your life. And then it's like this mural of your life on this handcrafted mug.
Oh, cool.
And so Nicholas Kuzmich, who's amazing when it comes to Facebook marketing, he was also on the show. I dropped him that as a gift. And like literally he sent me, a video via, iPhone, and then another Facebook message like a week or 2 weeks later, because he was drinking out of the mug. He's like, dude, I can't put this thing down. So that was a cool one.
I like that
really, really well. And so it just goes to, don't make sure it's not generic, make sure it's personal to them. I've sent Cutco cutlery. So where it's engraved their name, especially their spouse too, if you can work their spouse into the gift. Once again, how to show up different is a lot of spouses are used to their husband or wife getting love. If they're kind of in the thought leader space, they're used to kind of being left in the shadows and not really recognized ever. So if you can recognize the spouse or the children, it's definitely a way to show up way different.
So I should try to get Sarah like a really, really expensive and unique Cabernet Sauvignon.
She would not hold that against you. She'd also be cool with like some Lululemon sweats too. So
okay, all right, good. That's going on the list, buddy.
We're pretty, we like nice wine, but we're also pretty low maintenance.
Okay, all right. Oh, that's good advice, man. I think that the gifting thing sometimes too, like when you're a part of like a bigger team or like a corporate company, sometimes it can be really easy to give like swag, like company swag, where it has like just the company logo on it. It's like it just doesn't have any really thought behind it in comparison to what you're talking about. So I think that's an awesome piece of advice.
Yeah. So this is, once again, I'm giving you all of John Ruhlin's giftology book here.
Perfect.
A gift with your company's logo on it is essentially a marketing piece for your company.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about it, so I send out some nice cutlery from Cutco, and it has nothing except Brad and Sarah Johnson on it, right? If that's you, every time you use that, you're going to think of who gifted it to you. It doesn't need to have my name on it, my company logo on it. You're going to know. And that's one of the things John talks about, is make sure it's an artifact. So nothing against a nice bottle of wine, highly valued, but you drink a nice bottle of wine, it's gone. You don't think about
Well,
it.
wait a sec. What if it's like a collector's edition?
Well, then it sits in the cellar for a while. And
Oh, so nobody sees it.
right.
I
But
got
I
you.
mean, that's the thing. Like, a lot of things he talks about is bring it in the kitchen where it's going to get repeated use. And it's
Okay.
basically your price per touch, if it's something that gets used over and over. So,
Okay. Very good advice. I like it.
yeah.
A lot of business owners who end up watching this, they're going to wonder if starting a podcast is going to be worth their time or their money. So, how has podcasting led to more business for you, if at all?
Mm-hmm. So in our business, it happens multiple ways. And first off, I would not do a podcast if it wasn't for you, Charlie, and your company.
Oh, thank you.
Because and I think what's fun is how we were first introduced. Once again, the power of a podcast. John Vroman was introduced to me by John Ruhlin. So it's like this domino effect, right? Of great people know other great people. So I'm talking with John Vroman, and the company I was using at the time, great company, but there were a few more services that I needed to really get what I needed out of the podcast. And he's like, well, you should meet Charlie. He's the best. And you've absolutely lived up to that. So the first thing I would say is, if you're a busy entrepreneur running a business, make sure that podcasting is not something that where you're getting down in the weeds and posting to Libsyn and editing your show and all of that. If you're a business owner where a podcast is to serve your business. Now, if you're a podcaster, then you kind of have to do that, right? So I think first off, your service is built to help entrepreneurs create another funnel or another platform to get their message out there, right? And so to kind of go back as far as like how it served my business. So originally it was just to get this virtual mastermind out to my existing clients. The crazy thing about podcasting is, once you put this out to the world, you don't know who's listening. It's like, click, you're now syndicated worldwide. Now, the downside is it's like a blog post. The first time you write it, there's nobody listening, right? And so one thing I would say as an entrepreneur, if you have a business platform, if you speak, you definitely want to, I look at like my website as like kind of an old school wagon wheel, right? It's the hub. And now I've got these spokes that drive to the hub, which is where my podcast lives and breathes. And these gives are, right? So that I can get names and emails, so I can turn a passive listener into an active, real person that I know they're listening. And now that could be a stage that I speak at conferences. That could be my Facebook platform, my Instagram platform, my Twitter platform, my LinkedIn. All of those feed back to this central hub where my podcast lives and breathes. And now I offer value to where, if they go there, hey, did you like this conversation with this thought leader or New York Times bestselling author? If you liked it, here's a free gift we've made available to you if you want to dive even deeper. Click here, name, email, and then that's auto delivered. And obviously, Charlie, you're the guy that's helping with a lot of the back end where you take that work off my plate. So once, I'm giving you a really long answer here.
No, go for it. It's good.
Once you now know these are the people that are listening in and I'm serving, what you can start to do is interact with them. So just yesterday, couldn't have planned this better. I introed you to an asset manager that manages over $1 billion of assets. How they found me is I did a podcast with David Bach, New York Times bestseller, obviously really big in the financial services space. And so now what I did was I took that content. So it lives and breathes out on the kind of the hub that we talked about on my website. So one of the things that we've done, which has also been helpful, is we also video record just like we are this conversation on Zoom. So now we have the audio for the podcast, we have the video. So obviously we're doing the audio on Libsyn and all of the places you can find audio podcasts, but then we're also repurposing it on YouTube. And anyway, the president of this firm, we repurposed that interview inside of a wealth management article. So we took the content that was already produced. I had a writer help flesh out. And it was basically what every $1 billion, how to grow $1 billion RIA, I think was the name of the article. Well, of course, this is $1 billion RIA. So who do you think it's going to attract? So he finds the article on wealth management, and it's over his lunch hour. I was just talking with him. I'm like, how did this originally happen? He's like, well, over my lunch hour, I see this wealth management article. I see there's a video. I click, I eat my lunch at my desk, and I'm watching it. And then he reached out through the website and we got connected, and now they've become a client. So that's what's cool with podcasting is if you're having great conversations, bringing value to your niche target audience. That was by the way, that was also an interview I'd done like 6 months before.
Yeah.
So it lives and breathes forever. One of my running things with our clients is a lot of them are on radio, terrestrial radio. And my question to them, have you ever had a radio show that was a year old drive a lead for you? And they're like, no, that's impossible. How could that happen? Well, that's a podcast.
Right.
Because It's out there, it's living, it's breathing, it's on the website. People can organically find it through Google or stumbling across some video or, going down the rabbit holes that everybody goes down on the internet, which once again, that's why it's important to have a niche audience, because they're going to be seeking out the information you're talking about.
Dude, that is so powerful. Like that is, I think, inspiring for people because it's so easy to get caught up in how many people are listening, how many downloads am I getting per month? When you just described, well, it had nothing to do with the size of your audience. This is just something that you decided to record the audio and video, repurpose it into multiple different ways. You took a writer, you gave them probably the transcript, I'm assuming. They flushed it out a bit, posted it on a website, and you're getting a client from that. It's like they didn't have any other context for the show, or maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but they discovered you in a way that doesn't matter how big your audience is, you're reaching them. And so I think that's brilliant. And I think it's awesome if that's your target audience, if you're looking for that kind of client, to have them flush out a topic from the podcast that's, specifically targeting that individual. It's like, that's genius. So yeah, kudos.
I'm completely, by the way, not even doing that to the level I should be. But 2 points there, Charlie. Number one, if your show is designed, we're beating a dead horse here, but as long as you figure out who is your ideal listener, it doesn't matter if 10 of them are listening. Because you're designing this show specifically for them, they're going to start to refer that. And that's one of the things I found. Michael Kitces is another really big name in our industry. He's got a much bigger following than I have. And people that subscribe to his show, you go down to the bottom. We also recommend, my show's the number one recommended because we're both very niched in the financial advisor space. And so you can also, if you're niched well enough, other big shows will drive subscribers to your show, because I've asked a number of people, how did you find my show? And they're like, I listened to Michael Kitses's and yours was the recommendation right below there. So I checked it out. Right. And then we ended up getting connected through the show.
Yeah. You literally have, I read all of your ratings and reviews in iTunes, and you literally have people that have said, I found the show through the Kitses's show, and now they're listening to yours, and some of them even seems like they like it more. So it's crazy that it doesn't really matter, but doesn't matter like how big your audience is. The people, as long as you're serving, like you said, your ideal listener. And in your case, that ideal listener, in a lot of people's cases, it should be your ideal client, really, is who you're trying to reach.
Well, and I want to take this a step further, which, by the way, going back to, I wouldn't do my show if it wasn't for you. basically my commitment is I need to find very interesting people to have on. And then I need to be able to schedule an hour and a half is what we typically schedule on Zoom, just to make sure the technology is working. It's typically about a 60-minute interview. And then that's about it. You do the rest. I've got to cut a show intro after that. We kind of do it Tim Ferriss style, where we'll have a little, 3-minute, here's what the show's about. Here's the guest. Here's some topics we hit on. And then, oh, by the way, here's a free gift for the listeners. But I think going back to you transcribe everything. And you look at how Tim Ferriss wrote one of his last books, Tools for Titans. Those were just all podcast transcriptions with super interesting people. He wrote a book off of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Gary Vee, who I'm a big fan of, so he's got this content. We should probably, I'm assuming you're going to do this like a podcast and have show notes and links.
Yeah, we'll link it up.
He's got, and I'll get this to you, it's his content, basically his content method.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got this saying, document, don't create. And so if you think about it, I've got an hour-long interview. I've got over 50 hours currently of interesting conversations with interesting people. I've got transcriptions for all of them, thanks to you. And now I could write a book tomorrow if I wanted. But Gary Vee's kind of content, and if you're watching the video here, it's just an upside down pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
And so if this is an hour-long podcast or a keynote or whatever, if you follow Gary Vee, he's putting out 30 plus pieces of content per day on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, like all over social. And all he's doing is his team is taking little snippets. And so that's also the power of a podcast, is you're creating kind of long form content. Typically that can be repurposed so many different ways. If you have a team, that the wealth management article, if you want to write articles in industry publications, now you're creating all the content right there. And now just piece that back. I mean, you could take an interview, a podcast from 2 years ago, and you could write an article on it today. And then once again, you're going to link back. Hey, did you enjoy this article? Do you want to hear the actual hour-long conversation I had with such and such? Click here. Now there's your data capture right there. Here's a free give. Now they're opting in names and emails, which is obviously really important as you grow your business and platform.
Yeah. So many people I talk to, podcasters, there's always this debate, are transcripts worth it? And I think if you take it at face value, I think not really. If you're just going to spend a bunch of money transcribing the interviews, but if you plan on using it to its full potential, that's where it becomes super valuable. And I think it does become that foundational piece. You have a transcript, you can hand that off to so many different people. You can hand that off to an article writer. You could even hand it off to like a researcher. So it's like, all right, this topic was cool, but we didn't go into much detail about it. Can you flush that out? Can you research everything there is about this particular topic, and then hand that off to a copywriter and watch them create like an awesome 1,500 word article for you. And then you've got, all the different quotes that are mentioned, all the different little snippets of copy that you can use for social media. There's so many different ways to repurpose just one conversation. And I think a lot of people leave a lot on the table by not transcribing, because they don't see the value, right away. So yeah. I think that's awesome that you do it. And I think that for anybody else who's listening, I would highly suggest transcribing.
I don't do it even close to the level it should be done. I'm actually getting upset at myself right now. But, and I think the other thing that's interesting is I'm sure different industries are different, but one thing I've found is true in financial services. You can't control where your ideal client consumes content, right? So for our industry, LinkedIn is big. Mm-hmm. Everybody's on Facebook, and that's typically just to check out pictures of friends' kids and all that type of stuff. Our industry is pretty heavy in Twitter, especially in the wealth management side. And so going back to this document, don't create, and pulling snippets, whether it's transcriptions or audio clips or video clips, Gary Vaynerchuk's, his methodology is I put it everywhere. And mm-hmm. he's got a team of 17 people, so he can. But I think the key is if you're putting out great, valuable content, then that can be repurposed across all of these platforms. and you don't know where your ideal clients are going to consume it. They might be on Instagram because they're into photography, right? So I think that that's really key, and something I personally need to get better at is taking a lot of these conversations I've had and repurposing it across all of these different platforms to basically get good content in people's hands in the way that's easiest to them.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think a lot of people think, well, I don't have Gary Vee's team. I don't have a big team. But if you start somewhere, you know, it's better than nowhere. And I think that, you know, like you said, you can transcribe it and then have it repurposed. Maybe it's just in, you know, five different pieces of content.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, what I see, Brad, is they end up, okay, I can't wait to have this interview. I spend all this time preparing for it. I bring on the guest. We bring up a ton of value during this hour-long conversation, and then it's on to the next one right away.
Yeah.
It's like, but you have gold. You have gold in this episode that could be repurposed into so many different things, and you're so focused on like the next interview. And I think that it's such great advice. Even if you can't, maybe you don't have a big team, you only have a small budget, you can still pull out. There's nothing, it costs nothing to pull out 5, 10, 15 quotes from an interview and just post that to social. You know, you see Tim Ferriss. I mean, sometimes he doesn't even have a graphic. It's just a quote on a social media. And you're like, I mean, that doesn't cost a lot of money. So it's like, there's not really any excuse why you can't start small. And then, like, you know, as your podcast grows, or it makes sense financially, to increase the amount of content that you're able to repurpose.
Yeah. And I think another piece of advice, and, you know, when I first started my show, like I said, I'm not a full-time podcaster. I've got a coaching business for financial advisors. That's my day-to-day. And so I started my show the exact opposite that most people would say how to start a podcast. It was once a month. So if you're going to organically build downloads, you know, most people would say weekly at a minimum, and maybe even more frequent than that. And I think the one thing I focused, going back to what was the purpose of my show, it was to bring tremendous value to my clients. And so I focused on getting great guests on and having great conversations through the lens of how can this serve a financial advisor out there that's listening in. And I sometimes see people so worried about downloads and, you know, cranking out a show a week or a show every 2 or 3 days. Like, the content's not that good. And what you've got to remember is, as soon as you bomb 1 or 2 shows, we're like, wow, that was a waste of 30 minutes.
Yep.
You've just trained them to never come back. And so to me, the balance is, I would rather do 1 show a month, but just make it tremendously valuable than worry about, you know, all of the algorithms you have to put out new content and make more downloads. Because what you'll often see is those shows will maybe rank higher in iTunes, but they'll have not very good reviews. Yeah. And to me, it's like when I go on Amazon, I'm looking for the highest rated products. And I think when people go onto iTunes, oftentimes they're looking for the highest rated shows, because nobody wants to waste time. Nobody has it anymore, right? So why would you waste time listening to a show that's no good?
Yeah, I think if you can produce 1 episode per month, that's really awesome. It's way better than producing 4 episodes a month that are low quality. So quality over quantity all the time. A huge proponent of that, and I 100% believe it. And then the only other thing I would suggest is consistency. So, like, if you're going to do a show once a month, do it once a month. If you're going to do it bi-weekly, do it bi-weekly, and try to be consistent with the schedule. But that way people will actually know when and the next one's coming out. They'll get used to it. Yep. But I can't agree more with what you suggested with the quality thing. So, and you do a great job at that. You actually were doing once a month, and you scaled back to bi-weekly because you were like, you know what, I can actually keep up with this a little bit more, and I can actually make sure that these interviews are absolutely awesome. So kudos to you for that.
Thanks, man.
So Brad, I've listened to every interview from your podcast, and not because you're one of my favorite clients and I have to. I listen because your
not
podcast.
Because I pay you to.
I actually listen because your podcast is incredible. And even though you're primarily targeting financial advisors, there's so much value that transfers over to anyone building a business with the topics that you discuss. But in addition to that, a big part of what I believe makes your show awesome is your interviewing style. So when it comes to the art of the interview, do you have any best practices or tips that you wish you would have known when you first launched?
Yeah. Listen. I think a lot of people are so worried about what they're going to say, they don't actually listen.
Mm-hmm.
And if one of the things I try to do is I try to be a student of the game. And one of the things I can say with podcasting is, man, I used to take like Oprah, her job. I used to like say, oh, she's just a lady that sits on a couch. No, she is a master of her craft. To conduct an interview is one of the hardest things because it's like improv. But you've got to be on your toes. You've got to be listening. And sometimes it's just like these little things where the simple follow-up question of, why is that? Or, that's interesting. Tell me about that, actually goes like the best places in an interview. So listen, be 100% present, do some research. So I listened to a podcast with, so it was Larry King and Cal Fussman, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And they shared different interviewing styles. And I think I'm kind of a mix of these two. So the guy that runs the Screen Actors Guild, I forget, he's a famous dude. I forget.
James Lipton.
Yes, thank you. So James Lipton's style is he's like so well researched. He basically knows the answer to every question before he asks it. And if you watch one of those interviews, he'll like ask about like some little succinct thing that happened 25 years ago, but he already knows what happened, but he just wants to pull that out for the audience. Larry King is the exact opposite. He would be interviewing like some movie star on their upcoming movie that was coming out. They would send him the pre-release so he could watch the movie ahead of time and be super prepared for the interview. And he's like, I would never watch the movie because I wanted to be asked curious questions, just like what the audience is thinking, because they haven't seen the movie. So I want to ask questions that's in their head. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say I'm kind of a mix between those two. If they've written a book, I typically read it before the interview. So I want to know the content, but I also like to come from a curiosity of, I don't have the interview so structured. I know there's kind of some key things I want to hit, but if they say something interesting, and once again, if it's through the lens of how this is going to serve my audience, I'm like, that was interesting. If I'm a financial advisor out there, I'm probably thinking this right now, or wondering this, or this is an objection in my head of why this won't work. I'll ask that question. And a lot of times I'll preface it as, hey, honestly, if I'm a financial advisor out there right now, here's what I'm thinking. So what are your thoughts there? Or, how would you kind of explain that further? And so I think the key is serving your audience with the questions you ask. And one other comment that hit home with me, I think this was also Larry King. It was either Larry King or Cal Fussman. We'll have to find the interview because it was one of the best podcasts on interviewing. And he basically said, gosh, I think it was like Robert Redford. It was like a famous Hollywood actor. And he came on like Larry King's show. And Larry King, I think this was young in his career. It was kind of like he was asking self-serving questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found, like, especially if I go back to some of my early episodes, it was more about boosting my own personal ego than it was serving the audience and serving the guest. And one of the things that he said was this actor, I think it was Robert Redford, after he got off the show, he's like, dude, you're going to be back tomorrow. This is like my one interview with you. Right. And that's what I always try to tell myself is it's my show. I'm going to be on every episode. Right.
Yeah.
So it's not about me. It's about the guest and distilling and pulling out the best stuff from them for the audience. I'm actually last in line. It's kind of the audience first, then the guest, then me. And I think that's the other thing. You need to put them in that order, because if a guest goes off on a tangent and it's not there and it's not serving your audience, you need to have the ability and the freedom to maybe interrupt and pull them back on course, because they're there to serve your audience. And if they're going down some tangent that's, not serving your audience, then you're not going to have a great show either. So that's just,
yeah, I think it can take a lot of practice too, because you'll find your own personal style. But I think people are just like, they're really worried about what that next question is going to be. And if you just focus, I think I have noticed it from you where you're listening, you have your core questions that you ask, but the gold always comes from the follow-up question. It always comes from you actually listening to what they're saying and then following up with another question that goes a little bit further down that rabbit hole. And I think that's great advice. And I just think it takes practice, because I think your first interview, you're probably going to be thinking, what's the next question I'm going to ask? I don't know how he's going to respond. I don't know how long it's going to take him.
Am I going to mispronounce this word and look like an idiot? I mean, we've all thought it. And I think the other thing too, with a podcast, just be real. Be a normal human being. If you mispronounce a word, make fun of yourself and move on. And I think Tim Ferriss is one of the best at that. It's just like so is Joe Rogan. They'll just make fun of themselves, and don't be stiff. I mean, that's the beauty of a podcast is it's such an organic way to have a conversation, and that's why you can develop really cool relationships with guests that you have on, and just let it be like you're having a conversation over a beer, and don't overthink it. And be curious. I think that's another thing. I just always try to be curious. So one of the best follow-up questions is, why is that? Or why?
Yeah.
Some of the best questions are the shortest questions. And that's the other thing is early on, I found myself, I would ask a question and it would be like a 2-minute diatribe, right? And then I'm like, wow, that was really just to make myself sound smarter, look really good. Where in reality, some of the best questions are short questions, and then let the guest expand on it. And then if you need to expand from there, ask the follow-up question. I'll throw one in that, like, this is the proudest moment I think I've ever had as a podcast host. I had a guy named Don Yeager on, and he was he worked at Sports Illustrated for a really long time. And we got into a really cool conversation. I don't even remember how we got there. And he was doing a special segment. He flew out John Wooden, like 90-some-year-old John Wooden, obviously most famous basketball coach I think ever. And now his stuff is so good. He's like a business mentor. But he was doing a private mentoring session with Shaq as a rookie. And so Don flies out, and he's kind of a fly on the wall, just listening in and kind of writing this up. And he expected it to be a conversation on basketball. And in reality, it was a conversation on Shaq being a better teammate, a better dad. And it was like a life type of mentorship. And so anyway, so he tells this whole story. And then as an aside, he's like, and so I mentored under John Wooden for like a decade. And I'm like, what? Where, like, the natural curiosity kicked in. So my follow-up question was, okay, Don, did you just say like you mentored under John Wooden for a decade? How did that come to be? I was like, everybody just listening in is wondering that right now. And so then he said, well, it's interesting. After that conversation, I'm sitting there writing this article, and I go up to Coach Wooden and I'm like, how would a man like me, come to be mentored by a man like you? And Coach Wooden like pauses, and he's like, well, you'd have to ask. And to me, number one, that's powerful advice. It goes back to, you'll be surprised who shows up on the podcast interviews. If you're scared to ask, I can promise you they're never going to show up on your podcast. But you will be surprised if you ask how many people do. And guess what? If they say no, that's okay. And it might not be the right timing. They might be releasing a book a year from now, and it might work then, right? But so anyway, that was great life advice. But then this has been something that literally in a podcast interview changed my life. And I've shared this a lot with some personal friends. And so he tells the rest of this story. And so he'd been going out, I think it was every 2 months, flying out to see Coach Wooden. And he thought, he was getting up there in age, like upper 90s. He's like, this might be the last time. So Don says, he just wanted to leave things on good terms. And he says, Coach Wooden, I just want you to know, like if he, I don't think he said this is the last time, but he's like, I just want you to know, every time I leave your presence, I feel like I'm a better man. And Coach Wooden, he basically didn't say thank you or that means a lot like most of us would respond. He said, you should make that your standard. And in the interview, in that moment, it was powerful. But I went back and listened because we were cutting the intro, and I'm like, wow, that just blew my mind. Because I went back through my own life, and I'm like, how many times have I left a conversation? Maybe the the other person wasn't in a better spot. Maybe I talked bad about somebody else, or just stuff that normal human beings do. And it's crazy. So going back to, I would do this show, whether anybody listened or not, that small little piece of advice has changed my perspective on how I interact with people, how I interact with my children, my wife from there on out. And that all happened because of this podcasting platform.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the power of it to me, is you can just have so many incredible conversations that add to your life, add to your business. And just that small little 30 seconds of a podcast changed who I am today, just with that life advice. So you never know what's going to come out of it.
I love that, man. Thank you. That's an awesome story. Yeah, and I just think it's super powerful. So I'm excited for people to hear that, because I think these are the things that like people don't really think about when they're thinking about getting involved in a podcast. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
So I did a little digging and pulled up some stats, and I got some a couple of numbers here. There are over 525,000 active shows and more than 18.5 million podcast episodes available on iTunes alone. So there's a lot of content out there for people to choose from. At a certain point, most podcasters recognize the importance of getting as many ratings and reviews as they can for their show. The ratings help improve how well they rank in podcast directories like iTunes, and then the reviews are what convince people they should actually listen. So the question is, what worked for you in terms of getting more ratings and reviews? You have over 200 and that number continues to rise. So I'm just wondering, you kind of alluded to it earlier, but if you could kind of explain sort of any exact tactics that you have for increasing those, I think would be helpful for people that are listening.
For sure. Yeah. And I'll give a shout out to Jason Gaynard, who fellow Canadian. You guys are just awesome up north. I might actually move up there. But anyway, he runs a group called Mastermind Talks, which has been instrumental in a lot of my growth and meeting a lot of very cool people, many of whom have been podcast guests. So he shared, and I don't remember if this was in a Facebook group or something, but basically he had a formula that I've run with and has been super instrumental. Is so anytime you have a guest on, and I've had many authors on, or for those out there, because I know, Charlie, on your side, you do shows for a lot of authors, guys like Hal Elrod and Miracle Morning. And so goes back to serve your audience, right? And so and serve your guest if you do a guest show. So I will typically, anybody that has a book, I will buy 20, 30, 40, 50 copies. I think I've bought 100 copies of some. And I will build that into the actual intro of the show. So James Clear was just on. So I said, hey, by the way, if you enjoy this conversation, James was nice enough to autograph 100 copies of his most recent book, Atomic Habits. And I'll tell you what, if you're open to going out and leaving an honest review out on iTunes, we've made it super easy, bradleyjohnson.com/iTunes, with your thoughts on the show, how it served you, and then just email us, brad@bradleyjohnson.com, with your iTunes username and your best mailing address. We'll drop you a free copy in the mail. Thanks. So basically the dynamic, and you're running this all behind the scenes, Charlie, the dynamic is in that opt-in page. Typically we have some form of a free download, and they'll say, hey, do you want your free book? If so, click here. That takes them to the iTunes page where they can leave a review. And then they just email us, and my team will basically see those come in. It's interesting because I think we've sent out probably 4 or 5 books in the last week or two. And when you were talking about consistency of the show, I haven't put one out in a while, and I need to. Yeah, I mean, we'll have episodes that are easily months old. They'll still be driving reviews. And the other thing too, from a business standpoint, that's now a lead, right? So if you think about it, here's this person, I sent a book out to them, here's their name and address. What my team will often do is follow up, and we'll say, hey, Charlie, we sent you a book. Did you get it okay? And you'll be like, yeah, dude, thanks. I appreciate that. Hey, by the way, one of the things that Brad is always trying to do is make his show better for his audience. So out of curiosity, are you a financial advisor, or what, how did you find the show? Natural, organic conversation. They'll typically say, here's how I found it. Oh, great. And hey, by the way, in our space, there's a number of different, we've got asset managers, we've got annuity producers, life insurance. What's your focus? As you build a portfolio for your clients, what do you focus on? What's that look like? So now we're profiling them in a way that's very not salesy. And it's also for us, we now know who's listening to the show, what sort of content resonates with them, how can we serve them better? So it's serving us, but it's also serving them at the same time. And it's also helping us identify who are some potential prospects that might be listening to the show that we might even be able to serve at a higher level. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the format. It's driven a ton of reviews for the show, and it's brought more value to the audience because they're getting a free book out of the deal. So it's been a win-win.
Yeah, and you're really opening up the conversation. It's not just like, here's a free give and then it goes away. It's like you're following up and you're actually digging for a bit more information on whether or not they'd be a good client for you. And as well, some people might be thinking, well, I don't know if I want to drop $200, $300, $400 on buying books. There's another option too, which is you could just ask sometimes we've done this with your show, Brad, where we ask your guest, the person that you're interviewing, if they have a free report, something that would resonate with the person that is listening to that specific episode. And we use that free report. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't cost the guest anything. It gives more exposure to the guest. So it's like a win-win-win. And it gives something for free to the listener. And now you have their email address for opting in for that report. And you can follow up with them the same way with the book to get that sort of that review and as well as continue that conversation. So yeah, I really like that tact. And I think a lot of people should be doing it more. And you can get creative and there's plenty of other ways you could do it, but thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, happy to.
So this is a nice little segue for us. I actually took it upon myself to go through every single one of your podcast reviews on iTunes. And I know we're running up against the clock, so I'll try to be quick here, but there's over 200 iTunes reviews on your show. And I pulled out one of my favorites, and I'm going to read it to you. And I just want you to tell me what it means to you. So the podcast review goes, "Can't miss podcast. I look forward to each episode as they are released and get great information from every single one. The Daniel Crosby episode has only been out 4 days, and I've listened to it 3 times and may start over again. The process versus product episode, what can I say about this? This may be the single most influential podcast or book for me in 2017. I'm literally revamping my business using the perspectives pulled from that 30 minutes, and I can't remember being more excited in my 13 plus years in business. I'd give it 6 stars if I could. Kudos."
That needs to go into the Review Hall of Fame. Like, that sounds like I wrote it. If I could write. So yeah, that's humbling. Honestly, it goes back to the comment of when number one, try to serve your audience at the highest level. But number two, when you, and I don't even hit the button, you do, but once you put the podcast out to the world, you never know who's going to listen. And that's something that's been really cool is it's connected me with great potential clients that already, it's like this filter that they know who I am as a person. They know kind of how I tick. And if they're still tuning in and listening, it naturally attracts like-minded people directly to you. Mm-hmm. And that's humbling to hear that I spoke into a mic in a room somewhere in Kansas for 30 minutes and it impacted somebody's business. So
and not just anybody, someone who's been in business for 13 years.
Yeah. It's humbling, man. And that's why I keep doing it, is that type of stuff right there keeps me going.
Very cool. And just quickly, in your podcast, at the end of the show, you have this sort of segment where you round up, reviews from the week, and you actually read them aloud in the podcast. Why do you do that?
So I'm just stealing all my ideas from other people. So you can kind of get that from. So Pete Matthew,
why reinvent the wheel, man?
Yeah. So Pete Matthew, it just goes to surrounding yourself with great people. Pete Matthew was a guest. He was introduced to me from a guy named Adam that listened to the show in England, in the UK. And so Pete has kind of one of the biggest podcasts over there, Meaningful Money. And one of the things he did at the end of his show to help drive reviews is he'd recognize the reviews of the week. And, it's kind of everybody number one likes to get their shout out. So he found that drove more reviews is because he'd just read aloud some of the top reviews of the week, give them a shout out. If they left a Twitter handle or something like that, he'd tweet to them. And so I think it's with any show, with anything really, the more you can create a community around it to where people feel like their voice is heard and you're recognizing them for that, that's going to lead them to more of those type of activities. So that's who I got that from. I started doing that. And since then my reviews have gone up. So I think
That's
it's
awesome. Oh, it is. Yeah. No, I like it. I like it a lot. Brad, man, thank you very much for your time today. I'm going to end the conversation. I know you have to run soon, but I'll just end by asking one more question. Is there anything else you would like to add before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I think that you can not only produce podcasts, Charlie, I think you could be an amazing podcast as well. So if you're looking to start,
I'm mostly behind the scenes, bro.
Yeah, that was a great conversation. Great questions. I think I can.
I'm surprised it only took an hour.
Yeah,
I have 50 other questions I could ask you, but
well, we can always do round 2 if we need to, right? But no, I just want to say thank you. I know I've referred a ton of people in our space that want to get up and get a podcast up and running. So thanks for the work you do for me. Thanks for making it easy. Thanks for giving me the prompts of, hey dude, are we going to get this show out? And yeah, I believe in your service at the highest enough level that I'm referring my clients over to you to do the show. So thanks for not only taking care of me, but taking care of them as well. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge you for being such a powerful example of what's possible when it comes to podcasting, and for continuously finding ways and being creative around how you bring value to your audience. I appreciate you. I look up to you, and I feel incredibly grateful to have you as a client and as a friend. So until next time, thank you so much. And to everyone else who's probably listening, thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Brad.